My name is Sarah Manning. I am the Director of Communications at NDN Collective. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of NDN Live, and we really appreciate you for sticking around. We're on Indian time, all sitting back here in the green room, working out some technical difficulties, but so glad you all could join us. We could all just start by a little bit of engagement in the chat. Just let us know where you're joining from. Do you represent a tribal nation? Let us know in the chat right now. We're going to do our best to engage you all throughout the duration of this conversation. So really quickly, just a really quick introduction of NDN Collective for folks who may have who might just be learning of us. We're an organization dedicated to building Indigenous power. We, through a multi-pronged approach, we support movement building across Turtle Island. We are based in the United States, but our work extends beyond colonial borders to so-called Canada, Mexico, and surrounding island nations. So today we pulled together a collection of voices from our team and our relative Judith at Native Organizers Alliance to really hold a space to have conversation about this moment that we're in. Yesterday was this historic inauguration, and we really wanted to, in this time, unpack this moment and speak to our experiences as Indigenous people, unapologetically, with nuance, and hopefully really plant some seeds of critical thinking and give you all, our audience and our communities, some practical ways to plug in and take action and organize forward. So today we'll be talking about this new administration, challenges and opportunities with this new administration. We'll be talking about the news around KXL. We'll be talking about dismantling white supremacy and racial equity after 4 years of Trump. And then we'll also be talking about organizing forward. How do we care for our communities and the wounds that we know exist after a really tough 4 years in light of this pandemic and all the things? So with that, we'll just get right into it. I'll just quickly introduce our panelists, and they could all introduce themselves. But today we are joined by Judith LeBlanc of Native Organizers Alliance. Thanks so much, Judith, for joining us all the way from NYC. We're also joined by our president and CEO, Nick Tilsen of NDN Collective, and then two other members of our team, Sherry Andre, longtime organizer and team member at NDN Collective, and then Korina Berry, managing director of NDN ACTION. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. So our first question, before we get into this first segment on this new administration, I wanted to take a moment and allow us to really authentically respond to the feeling that you have. Like, what is your authentic mood after this historic inauguration? An inauguration that not only is taking place after or in this time of pandemic, but a very limited inauguration in the sense that there was this heightened security, right? We're all watching from our televisions, or many of us were. And then we're also coming off of some really intense 4 years, an intense 2020. A lot of people are just, ready for something new. So just really honestly, what is your mood right now after all of the events of yesterday during that inauguration? And we'll start off with Korina. And again, go ahead and feel free to introduce yourself first, and then you could respond to the question.
Miigwech Sarah and Buju, Minogigajame, Korina Berry, Indigenous, Mukwa and Dudame, Guys Agasqua and Dunjaba. As Sarah said, I'm Korina Berry and our managing director of NDN ACTION, which is our organizing, advocacy, and direct action arm of NDN. And Leech Lake Anishinaabe, calling in from Minneapolis. And today, I'm feeling a little bit more like taking a breath today. I felt a little disconnected from the inauguration yesterday. Honestly, I think in times of a pandemic and we're in back-to-back Zoom meetings and just like really having to be sucked into the work and like the active work and organizing we're doing every day. Like I felt really disconnected while also getting like rapid updates of, what was happening. But I was able to tune in and revisit some of the inauguration, and did find myself like moved and proud of all of the work that went in to get Biden and Kamala elected from our people and from our movement partners and organizers all over on the ground. And I also found myself emotional, like listening to Kamala's speech and just the history that we've made with her being Madam Vice President, and also like the representation of us as Indigenous women and Indigenous people in her throughout the inauguration celebration, but also specifically in Kamala's speech. And so, it's mixed emotions, right? Like, okay, wow, it's been a hard 4 years and a hard 3 weeks, and then we're here. And so I think for me this morning, I'm just taking a moment to like exhale and ready to get to work.
Yeah, definitely. Can totally relate. Sherry, we'll have you go next.
Hi, everybody. I am Sherry Andre, and I'm the Fiscal Sponsorship Coordinator with NDN Collective, and I'm calling from Nipmuc Territory in Massachusetts, and I am Puerto Rican, so I got some stuff to say. But first, I just want to kind of just reflect also what Korina was saying. I feel like this was a moment for a lot of people to take a breath and hold themselves briefly, and then also realizing that this moment of breath is, while it's relieving for some folks, it's not going to last long for everybody, especially as we continue to add layers of folks' identities onto it. And personally, this election of another president removes no weight of awareness of the continued work that needs to be done to create a world where we don't need a president, which is what I personally believe in, especially a president who doesn't actively recognize the harms and historical traumas and triggers of people who have lived on this land for a very long time, and acknowledging his own privilege when he keeps spouting this blanket of unity. And so that was really difficult for me to hear continuously throughout his speech, this push for unity without acknowledging these harms, the historical trauma of our people. And then also wanting to comment as a Puerto Rican person on J-Lo's performance. It's like a disgusting irony of a Puerto Rican person singing "This Land Is Your Land," which is completely exemplifying, white capitalist claims of land and territory. Puerto Rico is literally a colony of the United States. They cannot vote on the island for a president. They do not have a say in how their island is consistently impacted by U.S. militarization and imperialism. And she completely disregarded and disrespected sovereignty and autonomy of Indigenous people on the land that she's currently a settler on, and also the Indigenous people of Puerto Rico. And so I'm holding a lot of feelings, a lot more tense feelings this morning as I reflect on the inauguration yesterday, but also do want to, again, reflect back on this moment of relief for some folks, and definitely being ready to continue on with the work that we need to do.
Yeah, so relatable, and I'm really glad that you mentioned those really visceral points in the inauguration events yesterday. I know that was real for a lot of Indigenous people, and on one hand, we're experiencing the relief that's real because we just came off of 4 years of just outright like just racism rearing its ugly head, and so there's real reasons to feel relief and celebration. But then as an Indigenous person, to watch and see that, to hear that song again, it is an immediate buzzkill. And so I'm really glad you grounded us in that nuance too, because that's exactly what we're going to do on this conversation today, is speak to those dualities that exist for us, that we hold as Indigenous people. So we'll go next to Nick. Nick, what was your mood yesterday in light of all the things? And yeah, please introduce yourself first.
I'm Hamadakiapi, Nick Tilsen, Amachiapi, Trunte Awashten Apetuzapalo. Name is Nick Tilsen, President CEO of the NDN Collective. I'm Wild Oglala from Pine Ridge. And man, it was a range of feelings, honestly. It was a mixture of feelings. One, it was a big feeling of that our movements and that people of color in this country have the ability to shift power in the biggest, most powerful country on earth. And although and that we do have the ability to shift power and the decisions that impact our lives. That's the thing that was the biggest takeaway. All of the fake patriotic bullshit was a turnoff, of course. I'm not down. Like I don't ever feel patriotic on inauguration day. I don't have that feeling. It's not a feeling of. It's a reminder of the settler colonial state that we live in, and how hard that we actually have to organize to shift that settler colonial state to actually begin to make and meet the needs of our people and our movements. So it's like a mixture of feelings, like feeling like super proud of our movement and then like super disappointed on like this presentation of this so-called democracy on our lands, on the backs of our people. Um, and that's like every inauguration, I always feel like the duality of that. But when I was sitting there in watching the inauguration and watching all the congratulatory like stuff happening, I was like, there's two people in this nation that probably had one of the biggest impacts on this election, and that's Stacey Abrams and Latasha Brown. They impacted the course of an entire nation when they got 91% of Black women to vote in this country. And I just was like, I was watching. I was like, how come Amy Klobuchar is the master of ceremonies? How come that's not Stacey Abrams? You know what I'm saying? Like it made me think about like representation of power and representation of influence, and how everything is political on that scale. Every word, every position, every person who opens the door, all of those different things. But just thinking about like the sacrifices of the people who helped get our movements here. And along with the long list of people in Indian country who have made huge sacrifices to, get out the vote. So yeah, I just was like reflecting on a lot of those things and feeling, feeling a part of something bigger than myself, and kind of excited for what the future holds. Kind of excited that, I felt disgusted 4 years ago on this day, like a pit in the stomach. And this day felt a little bit different, felt a little bit lighter. It felt a little bit of, oh shit, we actually have an opportunity to have dialogue with this administration. We have an opportunity to influence and sit across a table and influence and push hard and hold people accountable. When under the last administration, we couldn't even get it. There was no invitation to come to a meeting. There was no invitation to come to the door. It was, we'll just see you on the streets, I guess, yeah, that's a little bit about like my feelings about yesterday and the duality of it all.
Yeah, that's real. Thank you so much, Nick. Judith, Auntie Judith, you've been involved in this work for a long time organizer and movement builder, was around during the civil rights era, during the Red Power movement. And I know this moment for you brings so much, so much more experience. And so I'd love to hear from you next. What is your mood after yesterday in light of all the things and what this moment means? But also, yes, please start by introducing yourself as well.
So my name is Judith LeBlanc. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm calling in from Lenape territory, aka Harlem, New York. And I have been here for a long time, so I walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. And I first thought when I got up early to watch Trump leave because I wanted to experience that moment, to see him walk away, fly away. And I thought about inaugurations in the past. There have been times that I was in DC protesting, freezing my tutu off, working, doing news stories, running from the cops. And then I thought about inaugurations where the only inauguration that I've ever been where I wasn't protesting was the first inauguration of President Obama. And I had a sense then of the possibilities because representation is important. People of color being at the table is important. But just as important, and we learned that through the 8 years of President Obama, is the content of what we do, what we bring to the table. And so, yes, I was exhaling with everybody else. I was just busy exhaling, but I was really struggling to keep my focus on the horizon because the next 60 to 100 days are really critical in setting a course for all of the policy changes that we want and need in our communities. But the one thing I struggled with, and I always do when there are things like the inauguration, is the complexity of having dual citizenship. We are citizens of our nation first, and we are citizens of the United States. And when we were working on the 2020 elections, and people would say, why should I vote? Well, my gut level reaction is, don't you want to be able to choose who's on the other side of the table when we're negotiating for our sovereignty, for our rights, to protect Mother Earth? Don't you want to choose who's on the other side of the table? I think so. So we always will struggle with this dichotomy of being dual citizens. And I think that for the first time, I really felt that we have power that we can leverage. And you know what? We're not used to leveraging our power. The Native vote in 2020 has caused already important things to happen. The nomination of Deb Haaland, for example, the executive orders on KXL. But you know what? I still, in the end, I still felt we were invisible. That what is it going to take for them to start an inauguration with the land acknowledgement? But then I also think to be in good relationship with that idea and that right and that part of ceremony that should be there in that place at that time, I also thought about, well, what do we do about that? You take, okay, I agree with what everybody said about Amy Klobuchar, but look, there were nearly 10,000 new Indian voters registered in Minnesota. Why didn't we say to Amy, land acknowledgement? She was the co-chair, and that's a constitutional thing. It's a political thing, as Nick was saying. But why didn't we say that? And that's the cautionary tale that I took from yesterday. We've got to leverage our power.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Judith. That's real. And I think, for me, I'll say that I also was like, working and actively like plugged into to um, to work in this space that's really intense for those of us that are doing work within our communities and movement building work. But I had the inauguration on in the background. And when I finally had an opportunity to like turn and really let it sink in, I actually felt relief personally. I felt relief. I felt relief that there wasn't this horrific display again of white supremacist protests. I was really relieved that there wasn't the violence that a lot of people were fearing. I was relieved that Donald Trump was gone, seeing that helicopter fly away too. And it was a little bit surreal for a second, just reflecting on the past 4 years that did we just live through that? Did that really happen? And it totally happened. And to me personally, when Nick mentioned 4 years ago when Donald Trump was inaugurated and elected, a lot of us were at Standing Rock, right? I was in Standing Rock the day that Trump's win was announced, and that was surreal. Like, and then immediately, his first day in office, right? He starts signing executive orders, fast tracking these pipelines, and even during his running for office, I remember the first time that he made fun of a reporter who had a disability. And that should have been the end of it right there. But that man made it 4 years. I'm a mother to a child with a disability. And to me, it was just unreal to me that voters and Republicans and conservatives and Christians who voted for him were able to look past not just that, but many other just outright, just inhumane, just disgusting displays of his character. And so for me yesterday, my moment of relief really came from like, as a mother, it means something to me too. My son having to experience certain conversations in class, certain displays of white supremacy from sometimes classmates and peers, knowing that maybe we can turn a corner now. Maybe he'll feel a little bit safer in his classroom. Maybe for me, I've had my own share of experiences where sitting in the park one time there just a couple of months ago, sitting in the park with my partner and our kids, where somebody drove by on their bike and Nazi saluted us and then flipped us off, looked right in our eyes. And that was also another surreal moment where I couldn't believe that I experienced that, and that the bee's nest of white supremacy was just poked at over and over for those last 4 years. And so while I'm not, I wouldn't say that I'm celebrating Joe Biden, but I was really trying to experience and hold space for that moment of relief. That's what it felt like for me. Later on in the evening, I was able to watch some of the performances and saw little glimmers of Native representation. I saw the Navajo Nation president standing in front of Window Rock, Arizona, the capital of the Navajo Nation. Got to see Miss Navajo standing there. We also saw, I think maybe it was Demi Lovato's performance, or I don't know if it was Katy Perry's, but you saw a Native man dancing in the background. And so there was way more visibility, but you're right, like, it's not enough yet. When are they going to say we're on Piscataway land and not just acknowledge that land? But then what? Next step is land back. What are you going to do for the Piscataway people that are living there right now? When are we going to get rid of that freaking song, "This land is your land"? Like, can we never do that ever again? Can we stop, including Indigenous people in ways that feel like we're tokenized, while at the same time erasing us and minimizing colonialism and the genocide that we experienced? So those are my personal reflections to that moment. But for our viewers, if you could let us know in the chat, how did you feel? What is your mood right now? And again, we're fully aware that there's a spectrum of experiences, and we could hold all those experiences simultaneously. All right, so now I'd love for us to get into chatting about this new administration. So coming out the gate, Joe Biden started nominating or identifying who his cabinet picks were, and among them being Deb Haaland, among them being other really diverse representations of the U.S. So there was a lot of excitement. There's been a lot of excitement about the opportunities with this new administration. So I'd love for us now to pivot and talk about what are the opportunities with this administration, what are the real things to celebrate, and then also what are the challenges. We know we don't have rose-colored glasses here. I know that. What are the real challenges that we have to prepare for? And we'll start back up at the top with Korina.
Miigwech, Sarah, and really appreciate everyone's words so far. And I think I lean back on some of those too, right? As we're talking about representation and all of the harm that has been done in the last 4 years and everything that has to be undone, like this duality of ready to push forward and get to work and organize and mobilize, and also the reality of like this new administration has to come in, and as they're starting, they have to undo so much, and then that's only getting us back to where we were at with the Obama administration in some ways, and so there's a lot of work to undo those harms that have been caused by Trump and his administration. And there are opportunities, with a confirmation of Deb Haaland at the Department of Interior, and the paradigm shifts that that representation creates, and not just there, but in other ways. But especially in the Department of Interior, and opening up even more space for land back and returning Indigenous land to Indigenous hands, right? Like these are exactly the fights we're pushing for. And we do see when we're represented at these tables and in these spaces and in these positions of power, that the conversations do shift and that the relationships are built and they are held. But also acknowledging like I never put all of my belief in these systems, right? Like they weren't built for us, they're not built by us. And so I really lean back to like our people and the power we build in our communities and how we hold that pressure and we push more pressure, you know, creating our own agendas and mobilizing around those agendas. And really pushing for somewhat of repair, right? Like we haven't had access to this administration for the last 4 years, you know, like there's not been good nation to nation relationships and building with our tribal nations and or even our urban Indian communities. And so like there's that piece of rebuilding, reconnecting, and also just what we know to be true too, that we are and have been invisibilized and left out of that table. And so, you know, I lean back into us and our people organizing on the ground and really mobilizing around the issues and the solutions that we know and that we can see to push hard against this administration. And so it's a little bit of like challenges, but also like opportunities and what I feel hopeful for. And I find myself less inspired and hopeful by the administration itself, but like again, the work that got us here, and then the work I get to see and that we all get to see every day on the ground, and that we have to continue, like we have to keep up that pressure. Like the work doesn't stop because we have Kamala and Biden in office, you know. Now the work starts now that they're there, and the conversations and the pressure we need to keep on them and the whole administration.
Yeah, for sure. So Sherry, what do you think? What are some of the challenges, opportunities, and things to celebrate and things that we really need to also be really sober-minded about in terms of the next 4 years ahead with this administration?
I think I'll start with celebrations. Just thinking, again, like what Korina said, I don't want to keep repeating, but just celebrating how many people mobilized and how many people engaged in political action in some way during this last election was really interesting to see. And knowing that like our folks have been engaged and doing stuff on the ground that maybe hasn't been recognized for a very long time. But just seeing new people start taking their first steps towards organizing. And I think for some people that is through political engagement. And then, you know, in my mind, hopefully they all become anarchists and, you know, step away from that. But so we have to start somewhere, right? And so that I'm still really motivated and excited by how many BIPOC folks took action during this last election. And that for me is really inspiring. And I think for me, in terms of challenges, you know, again, like Korina said, like it feels like we are just reverting back to an Obama administration. Most of Biden's cabinet picks are folks who were previous advisors or cabinet members of the Obama administration. And during that administration, we still had drone strikes. We still had immigration camps. We still had repression of organizers and protesters, and there was still the development of fracked gas infrastructure. So it doesn't mean for me that that we just stop, right? And I don't think any of us have ever stopped. I don't think BIPOC folks ever get the chance to stop organizing and pushing back against, you know, this government that does not make space for us because it, like Korina said, was not created for us. There's no intention for us to be there. But again, there, you know, you call them glimmers of hope, Sarah, of like these folks that have been on the ground with us, working with us, who are now in political positions where we know that we will be heard. I think this is the part where I feel like there's a challenge and a positive moment where like we just have to make sure those folks are supported. Imagine the amount of emotional labor that they have to experience to go to work every day, how much harm that they experience from, you know, their colleagues in movement, in political movement that they now have to engage with that we can't even imagine. Like, it's scary, and they're very strong people to be in that position, and we just have to make sure that we continue to support them in whatever ways we can, because we know that they hear us.
Yeah, really good point. For even some of the people who we believe in and stand behind, from Deb to some of the other appointments that maybe Nick and Judith can get into sharing a little bit more about, they're still operating within this system that they're not going to be able to change overnight. Like, thinking about Deb's appointment and how proud we are of her for a lot of reasons, and seeing someone who looks like us, seeing someone bring language and concepts and context to that position that didn't exist before, is really, really powerful. But at the same time, like, are we going to very quickly throw her under the bus if she's not giving all the land back? Is it really realistic for Deb to go fix all those things, right? And are we going to be so anyways, just thinking about just some of the points that you mentioned about they're still existing in the system, and they're doing their, and we could just assume that they're going to do their best and keep pressuring them as well, and remember that it's emotional labor, as you named, for them to operate in that system, and then also to try to be accountable to their own people. So with that, Nick, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more too about, like, from your perspective, what you see as real things to celebrate. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of these most recent announcements of some of our other friends and relatives who were recently appointed, and that are the glimmers of hope. And then also touch on some of the challenges. Realistically, as a movement person yourself, what are the challenges with this administration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, well, first, the dichotomy of the situation, right? Let's throw the system under the bus while lifting up the people, our people that are inside the system trying to change it. We don't have to, we can throw parts of the system under the bus that aren't working for our people while lifting up the warriors that are in the inside trying hard to make that system work. And I don't mean just change that system, but trying to get wins within it. I think there's a lot of people who are working and will be working in this administration, not because it's like just this inside outside game, but it's a place for change to be had and to be won. And one of the things that was super exciting, yesterday, is, of course, everybody's heard about the high level appointment or nomination of Deb Haaland at the Department of Interior, which creates a huge opportunity. So when we talk about we want to enter into a new policy era of in a new policy era in dealing with Indigenous nations and the federal government, we want to move away from an era of consultation to an era of consent and free and prior informed consent, so that when there's things that impact the lives of Indigenous people, they don't just have to quote unquote consult us, but they actually have to get consent and prior informed and uninfluenced consent of our communities and our people. That would impact everything from education to economic development to renewable energy to protecting the environment to the rights of our people. The Department of Interior is one of the primary mechanisms that will be used for a consent process to happen. And for that to become reality, it's not just policy change, it's also administrative functions that have to change. And so that's where the power of having somebody like Deb Haaland with lived experience from our communities and our movements in that position can actually help to really think about. Because you're talking about 100 plus years of changing a way an entire department of the federal government has treated and related to Indian people. So, it's both policy and it's creating administrative functions that to move from consultation to an era of consent. I think that when you think about the return of public lands back into Indigenous hands, like we're pushing hard in the land back campaign, or opportunities like the closure of Mount Rushmore and the returning of public lands back into the hands of the Indigenous people from the region, that stuff's actually possible. We actually have the ability to dream big, and we have folks in the government who can help make that happen. It's about creating the political momentum to make it happen. And the work that we're doing at the Land Back campaign, we're going to create that momentum, right? That's going to be a conversation. And then I think of energy development. When you look at all the things happening in Indian country that negatively impact the environment, our water, our rights, contributions to climate. The government's long-term policy in relating to Indian people has been largely extractive. It's been extractive. It's been using the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy to mine for uranium, to mine for to do petroleum development, to do all these extractive industries. And just yesterday, Wahala Johns from the Navajo Nation was sworn in as a director of Indian Energy at the Department of Energy, and this is massive. This is a big deal. If you look at every person who has held that position in the past, most people, Indian and non, have been pro-extractive development. And now you have somebody who grew up at Black Mesa, who grew up generationally. Her family has been fighting Peabody coal for generations. And she grew up in that fight. And she created her own renewable energy company and nonprofit called Native Renewables. And now she's transitioning into this position with all this lived experience and seeing the gaps that exist in the government, and with a mandate of combating climate change. So when I think about opportunity, it's also about the right person at the right time. Because if you end up with somebody who's super progressive, who's really trying to move something forward, but they end up in an administration where they're like, yeah, we just put you in there to add a little color to this. We're not really trying to, move the issue that much, Well, in this particular situation, there's a huge climate mandates, and a huge amount of those implementation of combating climate change mandates will happen in the Department of Interior. And Indian country will get a piece of that. To have a longtime activist and a community developer person, and in Wahala, an Indigenous woman that she is, she's going to fight for our people. She's gonna advocate for our people. It doesn't mean it's the same thing with Deb Haaland, right? She's not going to be able to change every little thing, but it's an opportunity that exists there. It's an opportunity that exists to change those things. I think that the closing of DAPL is real. I think that DAPL, that entire project is currently operating without a permit, and so there's actually a legal mechanism. There's a whole EIS that has to be done. That's just now starting about that project. It aligns with these, the climate mandates and some of the issues. So I could go on and on. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think the reality of where the challenges exist is we built a huge amount of momentum, like the collective we in this country, and to get to this moment. And it's not the moment in which we can lose that momentum. It's actually the other way. We have to keep our pedal on the metal. And the victory, this is the beginning of something, of a new way. It's not the end of, we crossed the finish line and we won this or whatever. But we have to figure out how to take this momentum coming out of coronavirus and coming out of what's happened in the last year, because pressure from us on the streets, on the easements, in the communities, will only help the people on the inside that are trying to advocate for our issues. And I think that for us, we have to recognize that we have to play the role of connector, right? We have to apply that pressure and leave the lines open for dialogue. And there was an absence of any kind of dialogue in the last administration. And this administration is going to do stuff that we don't like, and they're going to do stuff that we do like. But we're in a battle for our issues, and so we're going to have to pick and choose what's things that we're focusing on while we stay true to our groundedness and accountability to our communities and people and movements. So I'm excited about where we could head with this. And I think that there's a lot of I think that across the board that there's interesting appointments happening, and also what Sherry said, like there's also some terrible things that we still have to absolutely call out. And the reality is we can do both of those things. And so if there's any politicos watching out there, it always seems like there's this pressure that's put back on us as organizers that, be grateful. We gave you this, at least be grateful. We gave you this thing, so don't get so upset about this other thing. Well, I'm like, wait a second. We can be grateful that you helped us win this issue, and we can also talk about defunding the police. We can also talk about returning land back. We can also talk about defunding the military-industrial complex. We can also talk about those things. They can live in the same places, and so, but we have to create. We can't let them water us down and say, well, don't, just try not to have those conversations. Let's just talk about this one here. Because that's in fact white supremacy at work, right? So anyway, I'll stop there. And those are some of the thoughts.
Thanks so much, Nick. And again, big congrats to Sister Wahela. Just really beautiful news yesterday, and want to continue to offer her support in that role. So Judith, again, back to you. What are some of the other things to celebrate that we might not have discussed, or what to you feels especially poignant? What are the opportunities here, and also some of the challenges moving forward?
Mm-hmm. It's funny, thinking about the challenges and opportunities, the first thing that came into my mind was the American Indian College Fund slogan, "Think Indian." If you think Indian, we're not going to go wrong. So, for example, how do we ensure that we are in good relationship with the Biden administration? How do our tribes, our Native communities, our movements work to shift power back to the people and be in good relationship? How do we develop strategy and tactics that are in good relationship and ensure that we are mindful about the objective conditions, which is that we are seeing the rise of a virulent, organized, far right-wing, extremist, white supremacist movement. It's not a few bad apples, it's an organized movement. So how do we work to be in good relationship with the Biden administration while at the same time understand, not only protect our communities, but understand that narrative battle that we have to be a part of, that we have to use the power of our ancestral responsibility to challenge those things that get in the way of us being in good relationship. So, for example, I think the bottom line in being in good relationship is to ensure that free, prior, informed consent is the rule that guides what the administration does on every level in every department. But to be in good relationship means that in our tribal leaderships, in our communities, how do we build the power within our communities to actually exercise our sovereign rights? What is it that we have to do? We are out of practice. We're usually on the defensive, and we still will be. But we need to spend 60% of our time looking at the horizon and being on the front foot, being eggs. Thank you, Nick, for the graphic demonstration of what I mean. And we're out of practice. It's hard to figure out, how do you act in a more sovereign, how do you think Indian, if free, prior, informed consent is the guiding principle of being in good relationship? Well, I think we have to see organizing our power as building within an internal process of educating ourselves about how we deal with this system. This system is still very powerfully controlled by the rich, by the energy corporations. So we have to think Indian. So, for example, I think one of the initiatives that would give an amazing handle to the people who are our allies and our people who are on the inside of the administration, why not have a mandatory training on sovereignty? for every department that relates to tribal nations. Mandatory. What is we have our experts, University of Arizona. I mean, you can just we have John Echohawk. We have people who understand sovereignty as a moving and changing concept. In the 21st century, under the Biden administration, what does sovereignty mean? The legal side and the inherent and the moral side of sovereignty. So that's the kind of power we have to leverage. We have to think really to the horizon, Nick. Thank you, Nick. We have to look to the horizon for the long term. So let's think Indian.
Thank you so much, Judith. So, on another note of things to celebrate, we're going to shift into our next segment on the Keystone XL pipeline. So, in Biden's first day in office, immediately goes to the Oval Office and begins signing executive orders. And among those executive orders was stopping the Keystone XL pipeline. Huge news, and a lot of some folks were tipped that a few days ago that this might be happening. So to actually see it happen was pretty surreal. Now this is huge to celebrate. Like, let's be really clear about that. This is something to celebrate, and we'll unpack that a bit more in a second. But what I want to shift to right now is a real quick video produced by our friends and partners with the Promise to Protect Coalition, which NDN Collective and NOA are both a part of. And this video is produced to honor all of those who came before us to fight against KXL. This has been a battle that's existed for a long time. This has been taking, people have been arrested for this, have served jail time for this, have put time and resources and blood, sweat, and tears and prayers on the front lines to make this win happen. So we'll go ahead and start with that video. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit more about what this win or this executive order means.
Free state! Free state!
We're running out of time, and we need Biden to stop it now.
People are waking up to the reality that we only have this one planet in which we can breathe the air, in which we can drink the water, in which we can have soil to grow our food.
We are building a movement that is deeply rooted in respect for Mother Earth. Nothing can beat that.
Oh,
The classic, you're muted. Thanks so much. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Just had to say it. I needed at least one of those. All right. So yeah, again, a big thank you to all of our relatives who have organized and made time and effort and energy into getting us to where we are right now with Keystone XL. We saw a lot of familiar faces in that video, a lot of people who we love and admire and hold close to our hearts, including Judith. It was really great to see you in there as well. But Nick, if you could start us off here with grounding us in a little context. What has this battle been like in the last decade or so against the Keystone XL pipeline? Who are some of the big players? And what does this mean right now?
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, one thing for everybody who's watching out there, I know that folks are fired up. There's call to actions coming at the end of this, so hang with us. We kept the call to actions at the end, so you hang on to the very, very end. I know that there's comments coming in about calls to action, so we'll try to weave those in throughout. This struggle is a good template of variety of different tactics to win it, because there is no one strategy and no one group who gets to take credit for this win. And all of these things mattered. I think that one of the things that always matters first is that this struggle was started with prayer. This struggle, people prayed on this. People loaded their chanupas on this. People entered the sweat lodge on this. The Sichongu set up the spirit camp on this. And this has been a 13, 14-year-long struggle. Ranchers risked their entire land and reputation and their farm and everything in fighting for this. John Harder down there, a rancher down there, probably normally don't see eye to eye on every kind of politics. But he was against this because it was bad for the earth and it was bad for the people. And, you take a lot of players contributed to this. The Rosebud Sioux tribe, as a sovereign nation, took a huge leadership role in standing up against this issue and using their tribal sovereignty as a mechanism to fight transnational corporation. Organizations like 350.org, Indigenous Environmental Network, the Cheyenne River Grassroots Collective, Dakota Rural Action, the Braveheart Society, Native Organizers Alliance, Rosebud, Pine Ridge, Lower Brule, Cooley-Chasha, and all of I can go on. There's so many organizations. Our relatives down in Bold, Nebraska, and that whole crew. And I know I'm missing some out, so they're always saying, "Well, don't say if you can't mention everybody." But you all know who you are. And it's not just those organizations; it's individual peoples who are behind those, the human beings that are behind those organizations. Elders and people like Russell Eagle Bear on Pine Ridge, on Rosebud, and different leaders that prayed on this. And I think that in this long-term struggle, it's interesting to watch, right? There is the grassroots organizing happening. There is sort of like the bigger national NGOs that have political connections that maybe the local grassroots organizers don't have. You have some folks who don't know anything about the political process, but they're praying. They're praying, standing in the path of the pipeline. There is the politicals, and I think the reality is all of these different strategies contribute to wins. Biden didn't wake up one day and was like, you know what, I'm going to make the decision to come out against the KXL pipeline. He didn't wake up one day to make that decision. He was pressured to make that decision. He was pressured by the movement and by the people to make that decision. And so we said, well, when we vote for you, you better come through on your promises. You better close that border. You better stop KXL. And so, when we think about these things, we should not just think about like, oh, hey, some white guy in the Oval Office now now that he's in there, made these decisions that impact our lives. He made those decisions because we made him make those decisions. We made him be accountable to us and to our people. So every one of those prayers, every single one of those actions, every single one of those political conversations, every single one of those pressure conversations, the videos and the media and the narrative and everything that was put out there, it all contributes to it. And I was talking to an elder on Rosebud this weekend when this news was coming. And one of the things that he reminded me of was, he's like, think about all the people who have fought in this struggle that aren't here to see this victory. Many people in this long-term struggle, they have passed on into the spirit world. But even in the spirit world, they're able to help, and are feeling good about this on this day. And he said, my prayers are to, shift towards that when we fight a struggle like this, we risk a lot. We risk a lot for our future. we make decisions. We make decisions to fight a pipeline and to not do this other thing, or fight, put energy into fighting this and not do something in our community. Those are sacrifices that community and people make to do these things, and that he prays for, and I think right to be thinking about um, how stressful fights like this can be on our relationships with one another, and how they can divide our people and wear us down. And so, when a win happens, how can we be victorious in that win? How can the win provide healing to us? How can the win create a situation that can catalyze us forward? And thinking about those types of things. And so, this has been a long time struggle of this pipeline going through the heart of the Oceti Sakowin territory. And I also want to take this time to acknowledge that although this is a great victory for us, I want to acknowledge that our relatives in Canada, who, as we fight these pipelines down here, which are the mechanisms to move the oil, every permit for the last 10 years on the tar sands in Alberta, Canada have been approved. And that we have to find a way to use our movement down here to catalyze the support that is needed of our Indigenous relatives at the tar sands in Canada. And that these borders are colonial constructs. And one of the fundamental principles of NDN Collective is that we don't recognize the colonial borders that divide Indigenous people. And so, we're going to be coming to Canada. We're going to be coming up there. We're going to find ways to support what's happening up there, because that has to be one of the fundamental targets that we focus on in the future in this fight. Because the KXL fight is just one fight, and it ain't over. The reality is these victories are temporary. We're in a battle for something. Until every piece of technology outpaces, oil, we're going to be in these fights, fighting these infrastructure fights for our people. So, I could go on, but I know that just wanted to acknowledge all of the people who have fought for this fight, and many of us have prayed on it. Many of us have, exhausted our relationships, and everybody within the administration to help make this happen too. Because the reality is, people listened to us. People decided, hey, this is a fundamental justice issue. This is a climate issue. This is an issue impacting Indigenous people. It's important. And for everybody listening out there, who has sort of thoughts about the political process, this is one example. I'm like, that's a good example to point to about a political process that actually is working. But how hard it is to maintain the line at all levels, all levels. So, I'll say that much for now. And it is a victorious day, and I think there will be a big Wopula ceremony, a giving of thanks ceremony, and we will be strategizing about how we celebrate this moment, but then use it to catalyze us forward.
Thanks, Nick. And Judith, we'll go to you next. I know that you've been deeply involved in this work with KXL, with Native Organizers Alliance, with Promise to Protect Coalition, training people on the ground. This has been your life for the last several years. What does this win mean to you, and where do we go from here?
Well, I think all of the words that Nick said are so important. There are not only people who've walked on who started this fight, but some who've grown up only knowing it, because it's over 10 years. I know kids who grew up, who started in a baby sling, and now they're seeing finally the end. And so I think the KXL movement and struggle is a laboratory to study. Like, everybody who's concerned about social change, who wants to be a part of it, who wants to lead it, needs to study what has happened for over a decade on KXL and brought us to this point. Because it is the most potent mixture of prayer, of organizing, of legal struggles, and electoral power, each playing their role. It is also in order for us to lead, and this was a Native initiated and led struggle from its very inception. And most critical fossil fuel fights on Turtle Island have been, as quiet as it's kept, native led and initiated. And so you have to realize that we can't lead change, and that needs to be our role. We have to take that responsibility on. We can't lead change in environmental justice movements without the active participation of tribal leaders like Chairman Rodney Bordeaux, Rosebud, one of the first tribal leaders to stand up over a decade ago to say no, no. Or all the traditional leaders. We can't make change without the traditional leaders, the spiritual leaders who guide us, because prayer is a component part of a movement that can win. And we can't ignore the incredible sacrifices that grassroots leaders and people and organizations play. There's no replacement of any of those categories in a movement that we're leading. I'm just really proud that over 5 years ago, and I get a little emotional thinking about it, that after Standing Rock, we were in relationship with many from the KXL movement, Faith Spotted Eagle from the Braveheart Society as one. And they invited us, Dakota Rural Action, and those who had been working on tribal leaders and grassroots leaders, invited NOA as the first national Native group to come back to South Dakota after Standing Rock and to help strategize of where to go now. And what we were able to do is to broker a different kind of relationship with 350.org, and we need to give them a lot of props, because they decided and took a pledge after meeting with 25 Oceti Sakowin leaders, traditional tribal and grassroots leaders in Washington, D.C. at the climate march, that they would be an authentic relationship with the Native leadership on the ground, that they would not just send out emails and raise cash, that they would actually play a role in moving resources to the ground to support the leadership on the ground. That's a huge lesson for the environmental justice movement. Lastly, I think we shouldn't overestimate the challenges that we're going to face, and Nick is right. And someone told me, I think Faith was saying to me yesterday, the old stories of like, you'd celebrate a military victory and gather around the fire. There'd be songs and dancing, but at the same time, some had to be mindful, what's on the other side of the hill? Are they regrouping on the other side of the hill? And so this zombie pipeline, the final stake is going to take some more pressure, more organizing. And I really think that it is the first step in our playing our rightful role in shutting down the tar sands. Because this pipeline strategy that was developed by i.e. Indigenous Environmental Network in conjunction with our relatives in Canada over 10 years ago, when they decided the strategy is to go forward on pipelines, that was strategic. But now we have been fighting pipelines, and now we have the possibility of DAPL and KXL being shut down. We got the battle going on Line 3. But the truth is, we have to now think to the horizon. How do we take the steps now with this administration to shut down the tar sands, to aid and support our relatives, our northern relatives? That's what we have to focus in on.
Thanks, Judith. Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned really stood out to me as something that I've been hearing across different spaces where folks that I know that have been plugged into this work, Indigenous people in particular, have noticed that although there was quick acknowledgement of this news in mainstream publications, I don't know if it was like New York Times or Washington Post, and in a lot of those publications, Indigenous people were really invisibilized. Like it cuts right through Oceti Sakowin territory. It was Indigenous people. It was Rosebud Sioux tribe fighting this pipeline. And yet there's still invisibilization happening. And so just really want to continue to call up mainstream media, call up anybody celebrating this win, to remember the Indigenous people that have not just been fighting against this pipeline, but been fighting for environmental justice since 1492, been fighting to protect our lands. And so can't say enough how much we owe to the different types of warriors. And I say different types because there are many different types who have done this work and contributed to this work, to acknowledge their fight in this and express like just the deepest gratitude. And there's no way that, as Nick mentioned, that we can name them all. Before we shift to our next topic, and obviously on all these topics, there's just so much more to be said. And for folks watching, please continue to engage in the conversation and let us know what else we missed. If you want to acknowledge some people in the chat, do you know some people personally who you want to lift up and acknowledge who was a part of this fight? Please do that. But real quick, I'd love to touch base quickly with Korina and Sherry, and let us know some of your thoughts also on what this win means with KXL.
Do you want to go, Korina?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think just in terms of the KXL, I'm extremely grateful for all of the work that folks have done and the ways in which I've been able to plug in remotely. But also thinking about all of the other pipeline fights that have started and continue to fight, like the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which is the second leg of the Dakota Access pipeline that goes through the Atchafalaya Basin, our largest wetlands in this country, and the drinking water of the Oneida Nation is operational right now. And there was a big resistance towards that. And just thinking about all of the Indigenous folks who organized to fight that after, we were encouraged to leave Oceti Sakowin and take the fires back home. And just thinking about how these fights are still continuing and people did bring the fires back home and are still doing that work. So just like uplifting that these pipelines are all connected in various ways, right? And I think going back to how do we continue to provide that support and thinking of alternative ways other than just our bodies on the ground, because I think sometimes we get discouraged when we think we can't go somewhere, especially during this pandemic, to physically be in a place to resist. And happy to have that conversation. We just don't have time. And also wanted to raise up, that there was also a temporary moratorium on drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, which is the sacred lands of the Gwich'in Nation, which is so amazing that this happened. But as an organizer, when I hear the term temporary, I can only imagine what folks who've been organizing for so long to protect their sacred lands, their sacred rights, and their sacred relationship to the porcupine caribou, how exhausted they must be feeling. And I think it's really important that while we have these celebrations and these wins, and that we continue to keep our eyes on these fights. And I know it can be difficult because there's so much technical jargon around pipelines and what do these words mean? What are these permits? Who gets to make these decisions? It's still important that we keep our eyes on them and we keep our eyes on our relatives who are fighting them, because the more we pay attention to them, the more protected they are. And so I think that's another thing I just want us to be mindful of as we continue to have these celebrations. But like Judith said, like what's over the hill? Like we need to keep an eye on what's over the hill, keep an eye on our relatives to make sure that they get the support that they need, and redefine what that support looks like if we can't physically be there. I don't know if Korina has anything.
Yeah, I mean, Nick, Judith, and Sherry shared really powerful, important words. And so it's just a lot of echoing, I think, what's already been said, and really honoring all of those individuals and organizations and people that have been fighting KXL for years. And also acknowledging that these same people, many of them have been organizing and putting their bodies on the line and making those sacrifices that Nick talked about across all of these fights, and DAPL and Stop Line 3, just like putting themselves on the line everywhere, emotionally and physically. And we've even lost relatives to that trauma and to that breakdown of well-being. And so honoring them too. And then, just really echoing that, so excited and honored to celebrate, and also like really keeping focused on the next steps and keeping the pressure on, because there will be pressure from the Canadian government on this administration on all of these decisions, or on the pipeline, and and politics is politics. And so how do we keep the pressure on all of these fights, as well as to Sherry's point too, like there's a place for everybody in these fights and in these movements. And so it has been particularly hard in the pandemic to know how and when to plug in and keep communities safe. And I know this is a part of our call to actions later too, but to really plug in and help apply the pressure for DAPL and stop and Line 3 and all of these other fights.
Yeah, thanks so much, Korina. And Korina mentioned something that we're definitely still going to do in the end, and we're going to be providing a bunch of links for you all to take action. There are plenty of petitions to sign, organizations that are on the front lines to donate to. Mentioned some of them here: Indigenous Climate Action across the medicine line above us in so-called Canada, who are actively working to organize around stopping the tar sands. And the tar sands is basically like the source of so many of these pipelines, right? It's the monster, and the KXL pipeline is just one arm of that monster that, you know, we've been able to chop off, but that monster is still very much alive. And so yeah, lifting up our relatives at Indigenous Climate Action, relatives on Line 3, Stop Line 3, check that out. Check out the GNU Collective, and support organizations like Indigenous Environmental Network, who has been doing this work, fighting against pipelines for a really long time too. So from there, we're going to shift to our next topic, or our next segment. All the wins, right? But now the reality is that we are inheriting this really tenuous reality after 4 years of a Donald Trump presidency. As Indigenous people, we know that white supremacy has existed and been normalized in a lot of sinister ways that we see and experience very viscerally as the original people who have been erased in any way you could possibly erase us, right? Marginalized in any way we can possibly be marginalized. So yeah, although we had 4 years of Trump, we know very well that this country was founded on genocide, and then later built on the backs of slaves. So that being said, all of that history aside, these past 4 years have created a dynamic in this country that we experience every day. I mentioned an experience, you know, that I personally had sitting in the park. And I know we all have those stories, right? And so that work definitely continues. Just because Trump is gone doesn't mean all of these white supremacist organizations are just going to go to bed, right? So let's talk about dismantling white supremacy right now and what that landscape of fighting for racial equity looks like in this moment. And I know there's so much to be said on this, but we'll start here with Nick. If you could just frame up for us, in all honesty, in true Nick fashion, what does this time mean for us right now, post 4 years of Trump, in terms of dismantling white supremacy and continuing to fight for racial equity?
I mean, I think a couple things. It's been coming to a head for a long time, and the racism and white supremacy that we know to be true has become visible more over the past 4 years, of course. But as everybody was shocked about how visible this has become and how more organized that has become and how more resourced it has become, what people don't realize is that white supremacy and white nationalism aren't always necessarily the same thing. And that white supremacy as a system is the reason why things like pipeline projects can happen and fossil fuel projects can happen. And so I don't want people to be confused, right, by saying, oh, okay, now we're not seeing as much white nationalism happening in the country and people running around with guns now that we have somebody different in office, and to assume that white supremacy as a system is being dismantled because a new administration came in is a lie. It's totally bullshit. And that the Capitol, what happened at the Capitol, was a result of the militarization of our nation, because they've seen themselves as a militia, and so that, you know, I think that we have some huge concerns, you know, heading into this next 4 years, because the backlash of what happened at the Capitol, that shit is going to give them a reason to come down on us in our movements, in our people, in people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led movements, to come down to us and try to use the Justice Department against us. And we're not promoting for the over-militarization, because that in itself is a facet of white supremacy. So there's some real white supremacist structures that we have to be dismantled. So when we say defund ICE, defund the military-industrial complex, defund the police, what we're talking about is defunding white supremacy, changing the power structure so that's not possible. And because if you don't, just straight up, if you don't defund white supremacy, then white supremacy will fucking be here. Like, that is a reality. And so we have to come hard. And, you know, you sit across from politicals and they're like, oh, you know, defund, that's like highly political. And we're like, if you don't defund the police and defund ICE and defund white supremacy, our people will fucking die. That's a reality. Like, our people will die. Like, this is a matter of life and death. You know, you look at places like what's happening in Palestine, right? Like, that's a magnified example of what could happen right here in America and what is boiling right here in America if we don't defund and dismantle white supremacy here. And so, you know, I think these things are really fundamental for us to think about hard. And that's why, you know, it's one thing for us to push policies and to push, you know, structural changes. We have to think about how we change the conditions of this country, not just change policies that impact the lives of our people on a programmatic level, but impact the lives of our people on the massive levels. You know, so that's when we talk about like returning Indigenous lands and defunding the police and defunding the white supremacy. Those are fundamental. And I think and I thought about this a lot, like being somebody who, you know, was raised up through the American Indian movement, and being somebody who was, you know, my parents met at Wounded Knee and came up through the American Indian movement. You know, my grandfather had several threats to his life when he was fighting, you know, when he was representing the American Indian movement. And by white supremacist structures, and by, quite frankly, people within the government who represent white nationalism and white supremacist structures. And I think that there's a big opportunity here, and I want to say that, like, absolutely, as Indigenous people, we should protect our lands and protect our people at all costs, all the time, no matter what. But also, if you've seen one way to kill a movement is through violence. And I think it was Nalini Stamp from the Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter who was sharing this on Twitter about one way to destroy a movement is through violence. And so you know, that, and we're seeing that happen, you know, through this latest thing that happened at the Capitol, where their movement is becoming completely under attack because they took violence. And of course, I'm not one to believe that it's going to go away unless you actually defund the whole system. But yeah, that's where it's at right now. I mean, we have a responsibility to change the conditions in which we organize, and things that prevent us. I mean, laws that are on the books in 26 states that say that pipelines and pipeline yards are critical infrastructure. That's a facet of white supremacy. Oh, you movement for Black Lives and the Water Protector movement and Indigenous people's movement, you can't take to the streets and to the highways and block those things off because those are critical infrastructure. So we're going to criminalize your constitutional right to protest and to organize. That's white supremacy. And meanwhile, we're going to build fences and let these transnational corporations that benefit very few in the structure of capitalism, and while we prevent you from these places of critical infrastructure. And so when I think about dismantling white supremacy and going at white supremacy in the next, there's some big legal battles that we have to actually dismantle some of the laws, whether it be the Riot Boosting Act in South Dakota or the critical infrastructure bill that I'm talking about that's in 26 states, and these efforts to do that, because those change the conditions in which we organize. And we're in a battle here post-Capitol, because my fear is what happened those of us who are organizing post 9/11, we remember what that was like. We remember when they started attacking everybody who was an activist, everybody who was an organizer. How many of your friends and relatives got put on no-fly lists for simply protesting and weren't allowed to leave the country, and passports were taken? And so, we have to really think about what this actually looks like, and that's one of the battles that we have to really focus on, I believe, because it changes the conditions of how we fight. It's setting the battlefield of what this looks like. So, a lot of stuff to dismantle, but I think that there's momentum, and it shows that direct action and taking to the streets that has to happen. And so, therefore, we have to make sure that our people are not over criminalized when that happens, because if that doesn't happen, our country will not move forward.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, that was really great, setting the stage. So what I'd love to do now is just hear a little bit more from everyone else here. Think about what are some necessities, like in terms of the future of dismantling white supremacy. How do we achieve that? What needs to happen next? How do we move forward post 4 years of Trump? Not to constantly make it about him, but just to also acknowledge that these past 4 years were really had an impact that we cannot understate, right? So what needs to happen next? We'll start with you, Sherry.
Thanks, Sarah. Just thinking about what the last 4 years has been for me, I personally come from a mixed status family, which means that there are undocumented people in my family, or were undocumented people in my family, allegedly. And also just like my community. And so I come from a BIPOC community. Undocumented Southeast Asian folks were getting deported at a really high rate this past 4 years that went completely unnoticed by media because of what people think an immigrant looks like. And just the harms that came with that. Just seeing people ripped away from our families, being fearful of ICE raids, these contracts between prisons and ICE called 287G agreements, which essentially allowed police to act as ICE agents and arrest and detain people, just for having a tail light out or running a red light or running a stop sign. People would get detained and be held in prisons, essentially, and then would be transferred to ICE and then deported. And so it was such a it's still a scary time. I don't want to minimize that this is over for anybody or over for anybody within my own community or within my family. It is petrifying to not know if somebody you care about is going to be taken away, because there has not been, a very easy path towards, quote unquote, citizenship in this country. I think that there are some concrete things that we can do. I have a list here because I'm a Virgo of things that we could consider in terms of taking action, which is like, if you are a policy person, really thinking about how we can remove current and oppose any new proposed domestic terrorism policies and laws, because those laws historically have not been used against white supremacists. Those laws have been used against Black folks, Muslim folks, immigrants, other folks of color. So those are not going to protect us. We might be concerned about what people are calling this like rise of white supremacy that we have known has always been there, but these laws are not going to protect us because they are implemented by Homeland Security. They're implemented by racist systems that already have been targeting our communities on the ground. We want to make sure that we are working collectively within our own communities to build our own response to these violences that are enforced by the government, enforced by these agencies for a very long time. We don't need these agencies to protect us. We need to figure out how to build and reinforce relationships that we have with our community to keep ourselves safe. We know we keep ourselves safe. We're the ones doing all of that work. We just need to empower ourselves to continue to do that and find the resources internally within our communities. I think a lot of people are so stressed about whether or not they have financial resources, but literally historically within our communities, we have fed each other, we have clothed each other, we have found ways to take care of each other. And we just have to go back to our traditions and remember how we were doing that before we were told we needed to rely on these governmental systems. And we also just need to learn about the tools that the state uses to repress us. We know they're watching us. We have seen them watch us. They watched us during Standing Rock. They've watched us even before then. During AIM, folks were being watched and surveyed. COINTELPRO is a real thing, and we need to take that seriously if we want to continue to do this work. And that is a part of dismantling white system, is knowing white supremacy, is knowing the tools that they use against us so that we can protect ourselves. And I'm not saying this to scare people, but it is a very real thing. And for some people, they don't get to navigate their lives thinking that these things don't exist. They have to be very real about these tools that are being used against them. And if we want to be in community with those people, we really need to respect their level of fear and anxiety and make sure that we are knowledgeable about the ways that they are protecting themselves. I could also talk about white supremacy for days, so I'm going to hand it over to somebody else.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sherry. Yeah, all of that. Korina, what are some other important steps that we can take as individuals that we need to apply pressure on in this new space that we're in order to achieve or continue to work towards racial equity while dismantling white supremacy?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. You know what I'm thinking of, and I've been reflecting on and listening to Nick and Sherry and appreciating their responses to this big, this big need to dismantle white supremacy and uproot these systems that oppress us in our communities. And I kept coming back to COVID-19 and the negligent response and handling of it, and that alone, and that in itself was another moment of white supremacy at work. And then I think of survival and I think of livelihood. And so I'm thinking of like, where are people in other communities that were disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, like today in this moment, right? Like we have lost so many community members because of the lack of response and attention to our communities in this pandemic. And this pandemic has exacerbated those existing inequities and disparities across all areas, with jobs and education, child welfare and removal of our kids, like it, housing, and we're seeing the increased numbers in our communities of unhoused relatives. And so I'm leaning into that too, of like in this moment, like we're talking about the Biden-Harris administration, we're talking about the federal government, but also like really in needing, Biden and Harris to act quickly on relief and care to, related to COVID-19, and especially our Indigenous communities and our Black communities and other communities that were disproportionately impacted by this pandemic and have gone unsupported. But also like the importance and the power in the local level, right? And like how we dismantle these systems. And so it is important to keep our intention there, and the attention is there, and we have organizers and movements happening in every state, working to dismantle our education systems, working to dismantle and defund the police, working to dismantle and pushing for more calls to defund child welfare, housing solutions, all of these things that really need to be, led by and created by our communities. And I think those are so important, and that's where we need to continue to apply pressure, because there is so much power there, and that is like our livelihood. That's where we're at every day, and we see our relatives, our families who are struggling, and until like I always hear, coming from a life in social work and child welfare, like you always hear these words of reform, and it's like, nah, like we're not reforming anything. That's like a band-aid. And so like we truly need to be creating clear agendas and applying pressure for completely dismantling the systems as they exist, because they're doing exactly what they were built to do, to oppress us and our people. And so yeah, that's kind of what I was really thinking of. I think just thinking of the many people of our communities, our relatives that are in survival mode, and that has been exacerbated because of this pandemic and because of white supremacy and the way that was handled.
Absolutely. Thanks, Korina. And Judith, on this too, I know that you've also, been a part of a number of different movement spaces where this has been a part of your life's work as well. What needs to happen next on this field of dismantling white supremacy?
Again, we are in a moment with incredible opportunities and possibilities. This is a moment when a majority of people in this country have been discussing systemic racism. Never in my lifetime have we seen that kind of widespread debate, discussion, and yes, reaction. What happened on the Capitol was a reaction to our growing power, our collective, multiracial growing power to oppose systemic racism. Biden was the first president in history to mention systemic racism in an inaugural speech. That is a reflection of our work, that millions participated in protesting the murder of George Floyd, took down statues of Columbus, of civil rights. Hell, after 30 years of organizing, we got rid of racist mascot names in Major League Football and the NFL. So we raised the issue. He said it. One of the first executive orders was an order on a very detailed order on how the government structure should function on the basis of equity. When you read that, the potential for what we can do on structural change to meet the needs of our tribal nations and communities for all people of color, amazing. But do we have the expertise? Do we have the political will to push on that expectation that has been set from that executive order? Because the thing is this: militarism, misogyny, racism, they are woven into the economic system. And the political system reinforces that economic system. And so we have to take something like dismantling white supremacy in bite-sized portions, because that's how we win over a period of time. That's what KXL teaches us. So for example, I totally agree. The first big issue was a just transition from COVID. COVID uncovered the huge health disparities in our community, all communities of color, rural communities. That's job number one. Number two, we have to continue the fight for political representation of Indigenous people, people of color, working class people on every level of government, because we're bringing something to the table that will dismantle white supremacy. And lastly, our responsibilities in the social narrative change world. Look, the majority of mascots in this country are in public high schools where our children go. They're in public high schools where if you want to dismantle systemic racism, then you better be down and dirty and do the kind of organizing that is values-led, that is not afraid to get into the mix and talk to people who hold in their brain at the same time racist stereotypes and a good hat, and wanting the kind of unity that we need, but we need unity on purpose. So I say deep solidarity, keep building on the lessons we've learned in this last year, deep solidarity. And secondly, we've got to learn how to be good relatives in the fight to change the system, because there are levers we can lift to take us to that next stage of reaching that horizon of no more racism, no more white supremacy.
Thanks, Judith. It's a really great segue into our closing segment, actually. You named a lot of things that will be really relevant here as well. So just naming the fact that we are in this moment of pandemic still. There still is a lot of angst that exists. Real reason to celebrate, but the reality is still there of this moment. And so our last segment, we're going to talk about organizing forward and community care. At Indian Collective, we're always talking about, as Nick mentioned, like celebrating how to celebrate these wins, but always organize forward to acknowledge moments when there are real losses and what to take from that, and how to always organize forward. And in the meantime, Judith touched on this, Nick touched on this, a lot of you did. Like, how do we be good relatives to each other? How do we continue to acknowledge those spaces in our communities, in our families, in our homes that have really been stressed by this time? How do we notice that in ourselves? And so to close out, I'd love to hear from each of you on these two topics of organizing forward and community care. How do we move forward in a healthy way, in a sustainable way that's really responsive to the reality of who we are as human beings, as spirits that have emotions and visceral responses to what we're going through? And then also when you're speaking, because we'll just go around to each person one more time here. If you'd like to share then other ways that folks can take action, since we're talking about organizing forward, we want our audience to know like how they can personally take action, what can they contribute to, what petitions can they sign, and so on. So we'll go ahead and start off this segment with Sherry.
Thanks. Yeah, this question is really meaningful to me and really hard, because I think one of the things that brought me to NDN was recognizing that I wasn't taking care of myself as an organizer. I wasn't taking the time to heal and process the things that had happened to me and my body. Personally, I'm pregnant at the moment, and I'm feeling all of the pains within my body from the ways in which I've put my body physically in front of things or in the way, and to protect space or to draw attention to space. And it's something that I'm now like reliving all of these experiences I had on the ground as an organizer within my body in a very different way, in a time of celebration of what's happening with me. And that's been really hard. Also made the mistake of trying to reread Parable of the Talents during this time. It's very scary. Don't do it. Would not recommend. But I think in terms of as an organizer, one of the things I have found when I come home or return home is really say hello to my space, like welcome myself back into space that I know is, I think some spaces are not safe, but feels safe to me. And I think this is a ritual that I've done a lot after being on the ground in my own community or in other communities of, calling myself back to myself and calling myself back to a space that's really central and grounding for me. And that looks like, like touching things and saying hello and engaging all of my senses in one space. So that is one practice. But I think in general, for all of us as organizers or people who are engaged in this work in some way, I think some of the next steps in terms of moving forward is really, again, building relationships and fortifying relationships we have, not extractive ones, not ones that are built because you think that you can get something from somebody else because you need to tokenize a BIPOC person in order to move, whatever your agenda is, but real, genuine relationships built on trust so that we can move forward. The more we trust each other, the less likely the government can break us up, the less likely we will be infiltrated, right? So we need to build genuine relationships. I'm saying all this on Facebook. I don't have any delusions that they don't know what we're trying to do, right? We need to also acknowledge and repair harms that already exist within our movement spaces. There's anti-Blackness, there's there's homophobia, transphobia. We are not making spaces accessible to folks with disabilities at all, by any means, and folks with different bodies. We need to address the ways in which we do not create space for our relatives and the ways that this overarching white supremacy that we're trying to battle does. We don't need to keep exemplifying that within our own movement spaces. And that work is healing. That work is acknowledging harms and working to fix them in a way that we know reflects our values and our cultures, right? And I think we need to embrace our anger. There's a lot of ways in which I personally feel like I can't sit still or process things in a way that other folks can. But for me, processing means I take action. And I think we can harness our anger and appreciate it in ways that, we've been told not to have it. We've been told to ignore it by white spaces, white movement spaces, but actually harness that anger into something that is proactive and to take action, take direct action towards whatever it is that we're interested in fighting, because that work, again, personally for me, is healing justice work. I think ignoring direct action as a tool of healing justice is completely wrong. It is healing, especially for BIPOC folks. And I guess the last thing I would say, I have a lot to say about this, but we all have lots to say about everything, right? I was told not to talk like an auntie, though, before we got on. Is I encourage folks to find out if prisons near you have 287G agreements with ICE or IGSAs, intergovernmental agreements with ICE, to see if you can put pressure on them to end these agreements. They can be terminated at any time. You don't have to wait for a term to be over. And also encourage folks, if you are in the Northeast, like I am, to support the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, a 24-hour support line for folks who have experienced police violence and ICE violence. And they also connect people to legal services, childcare, COVID relief work. They do all of the things with very minimal staff. They have 3 staff, and all the rest of the work is volunteers from community. And they have been really instrumental in my growth and development as an organizer, and would encourage folks to do that. And also, if you are in the Gulf, I really encourage you to put pressure on prisons when you know that a hurricane is coming. This is a moment of climate justice work that I think a lot of people are not very aware of, but oftentimes those prisons are not evacuated when a natural disaster is going to happen in those areas. And putting pressure on the right folks to make sure that people are evacuated and safe is really important. Those are my mini calls to action to folks, and I'll let you pass it on.
I did it again. Yay. All right. Oh, so Korina, shifting to you, just weigh in also on organizing forward and community care, and then also lift up any calls to action that you might want to share here as well.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And I'll be quick because I know we're running close on time, and I just want to uplift everything that Sherry already said, that and so much more. And I know folks have not stopped organizing and have been busy. And even with this inauguration and moving forward, boots are going to be on the ground, and everyone's going to keep pushing and fighting. And I think along the lines of what Sherry is sharing is to encourage us to slow down in moments and really check in with ourselves and check in with our orgs or the groups we're organizing with on our intentions and our values around what we're organizing around, what we're fighting for, checking in on who's at the table, who isn't at the table, who should be, how are we redistributing and sharing power and resources, all of those really important things, because there is so much to do ahead of us, and really just leaning more on the self-care and community care. It's been a hard 4 years. It's been a hard few weeks. I'm tired. I know so many people are exhausted, but also equally inspired and ready and going to continue moving. And so I think there's so much we have to learn from our own Indigenous values and how we are in good relationship with ourselves and the land and others. But also from thinking of, the mutual aid work that happened this last year following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many others, as well as, in this time of this pandemic. And there's so much I hope that we learn from that and we carry forward, and how we check in on each other. Isolation is hard, especially in this pandemic. But what are the needs of ourselves and other people in our movements, and also just in our community? Really slowing down and creating time to do that, because we need that for our own well-being and to sustain ourselves and these movements. And so with that, I'll throw it to some of the others so I don't take up too much more time.
Thanks, Korina. Nick, organizing forward and community care, and then lifting up any other calls to action.
I'll focus on organizing forward. I'm not the best at community care, so I'm like, you know what? We'll be taken care of when we win. That's what we'll be taken care of. I think on a real note, I think about, and I talk about this at NDN Collective sometime, about trying to live the life that we want to live now instead of treating it like it's some destination that we're going to arrive at someday. Someday we're going to arrive at some island called liberation and everything's going to be all right. As opposed to that in these fights and all the things that we're doing, we could be living that life now while we're doing these things. We could be practicing and living the life of our ceremonies. We could be speaking our language. We could be teaching the things that we want to be teaching. We could be taking care of ourselves and modeling how to do that so other people do that. And I'll be the first to say, like, you know, like, I'm not good at that. Like, I feel like it's something that we have to learn, right? I always feel like on guard. I always feel like, you know, I always feel like I'm sort of like.
A medium? Yes, please. A medium? Yes, please. Yeah. Or small, medium? Part two.
Is the thing that is really like a journey that I want to be on in a transparent way, because I feel like we can pace ourselves. We can be fighting these intense battles while taking care of ourselves, while providing and living that life. And so on the journey of how to do that and come up with practices of how to do that, because the fight is going to be here for generations. It's in us. It's in our children. It's going to be in our future. And so, like, to me, it's not about pacing yourself, because I'll be the first one. I'm like, don't pace yourself. Like, we need that. We need all hands on deck. You know, but it's not about pacing yourself. It's about creating a culture of care of how do you take care of yourself while you do that. And I really like what Sherry said about how do we repair harm within our movements, because we are not each other's enemies of what we're fighting. But what has happened to us through colonization and what's happened to us through these oppressive systems is we've been pitted against each other. And so we've created cultural norms that are contrary to the very liberation that we're fighting. And so, like, you know, anti-blackness education and training has to be like a fundamental part of movement spaces. And all these other things that we just have to make standardized of how we roll as movements and organizations that are, and people that are creating changes. And so it's not about like, oh, hey, did you get all trained up? Okay, now you're all trained up. We'll get you out there on the front line. Everything's gonna be all right. It's about creating that culture of how to keep that moving forward over time. And it's something I learned in my own home community when I was doing the work at Thunder Valley, is always trying to put yourself and be in the place of being a student. Always admitting what you don't know. And because by admitting what you don't know, it leaves the space open for you to receive and to be a student. And I think that if we can be students of change and students of each other, like perpetually, then we're going to get to that place of healing. And it's part of maybe one of the characteristics of that pathway of healing and care.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. I love what you mentioned about, you know, this feeling of like just being organizers, like pedal to the metal. And it made me think of the fact that some people talk about like balance, but it's like a rhythm is one way that I've heard it too, right? Like sometimes your pedal is to the metal and then you carve out space to slow down and have that rhythm in your life so that you're not always with your pedal to the metal. Because at the end of the day, our relatives and our families need us. Did you want to add something, Nick?
I just had two calls to actions. I totally forgot my call. Got all up in this conversation. I forgot my calls to actions. So two big ones. Um, One is consistent with our land back campaign. We have a petition going around that calls for the closure of Mount Rushmore as an international symbol of white supremacy and the returning of of public lands in the Black Hills to the original stewards of these lands. Um, and I think that this is really important when we think about back to our previous conversation about attacking symbols of white supremacy. And Mount Rushmore is one of those symbols. It's one of those symbols, and it's a tangible symbol that directly connects to land back to Indigenous people too. And so, sign the petition. I know that because the politics have changed, we have to update that petition. Before it has a different secretary on there, and we need to update it to who the new secretary is. So I know that people are like, "Hey, wait a second! I thought Deb Howland's the secretary now." Yeah, yeah. We'll update that petition. So just putting that out there. So that's one call to action. Another is going to come at the very end here. We have a video. We have an awesome video that talks about the future and the future of Biden's decision to close DAPL. And so this video was created, and we want to share that. And people are texting no DAPL to 43428, and sending the message for the president to take action in the first 100 days of closing down DAPL because it is currently operating without a permit when the EIS isn't done, and it is illegally operating currently. So anyway, just want to put those two calls to action out there and keep, I'll stop there. Check.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. And Judith, if you could close this out here with some anti-wisdom, organizing forward and community care. How do we move forward in a sustainable way as good relatives? And then also, what are some other important calls to action that you'd like to lift up?
Mm-hmm. I think it is really a moment when we have to continue to remind ourselves of how much it takes to achieve social change, to make sovereignty a reality, to end systemic racism. And I'm very mindful of what everyone has said about how we stay strong. And for me, I try to struggle to make it a practice to understand love of self, love of relatives, love of our people, love of our communities, love of humanity, of the natural world. Because again, this system has distorted love. Love is really about discipline. It's about accountability. It's about the willingness to play your role in the circle. Everybody's role is different. People want to talk about lateral violence. Well, let's look at some of the roots. The more we understand the purpose of being together in a circle, the more defined our roles will be, because everyone plays a different one. So that organizing premise of organizing with love, out of ceremony, in prayer, relating to our core values is critical. In the next 60 to 100 days, we're going to be scrambling. Most of these executive orders have a 60 or 100-day shelf life. That is the window of opportunity for us to press forward on an array of issues. And if organizing is our medicine, which I believe it is, because we are working together to make change, that is medicine, then we have to think about the campaigns we wage as being full spectrum campaigns. I know in the 2020 Natives Vote work that we did, we had over 100 moccasins on the ground in 9 states, mostly on reservations. We waged a very conscious full spectrum campaign, an organizing strategy, of course, a narrative strategy, of course, but we also had a cultural strategy. And that was that we were taking a political initiative and bringing into it prayer and ceremony and our cultures to make that political initiative stronger and have impact and to build Native grassroots political power. Now, one of the calls to action is, especially with these executive orders around Bears Ears and the Arctic, how do we move on sacred sites, sacred places that have been under attack by the fossil fuel industry, by white supremacy? We need a full spectrum campaign, organizing, narrative, but we need a cultural strategy. And I say this because the work around sacred places and protecting them is a way that we can remind the Biden administration of their promises and their ancestral responsibilities, to protect these sacred sites. So we are launching soon with a number of other organizations to be named a totem journey, the Red Road to DC. Traditional Lummi carvers, Jewel James, we're buying a tree. Damn, I never knew how expensive a tree could be until we shelled out $6,000. They're carving a totem that will make its way to DC to be gifted to the Biden administration and Deb. And it will stop at the Snake River Dam, where the struggle goes on to restore and renew the salmon. It will go to Bears Ears. It will go to Chaco Canyon. It will go to the Black Hills, and it will be welcomed in ceremony. And all those prayers and all that organizing and all the heart and soul that is driving these movements to protect our sites will go to DC on a red road. We'll gift it. We'll have an event that kind of shakes up things, that makes sure that they are reminded they have their role to play, and we are not forgetting. So go to our website, nativeorganizing.org, to find out the details about the Red Road to DC and how you can be a part of it. We're going to do some virtual stops as well. We can't go to Mauna Kea. We can't go to the Arctic, but we can bring them to us. So I hope that people will join and support this effort.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Judith, and thanks to everyone on this panel. I really appreciate all the shares. So this actually wraps up our show today for NDN Live. I just want to say a special thank you to all of our viewers and relatives out there who tuned in and participated in the chat and lifted up other important topics as well. We totally see you, and as we all know, we could go on and on for days on these topics. But for now, I also, before we want to close, want to thank our producers behind the scenes who have made this show possible. To Lorenzo, who is behind the scenes right now, managing in the green room. Thank you so much, Lorenzo, and to Willie for making this all come together in such a beautiful, strong way, and pinging me every time I mute myself, and reminding me so gracefully. We Indians out here, so we're doing our best. So thank you so much for bearing with us, and then to Jordan for the opening music and for the work around the graphics, and then also for extra support, our honorary comm support person Jade, who has been instrumental in also helping to shape this show. And so yeah, sending lots of love to you all out there, and again, continue to take care of yourselves, take care of each other. This is an exciting time. Celebrate the wins and organize forward. So thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you.
Dapple inashi chincha lila skinchi nashilia piki aping de trawachi. Meniki washtena voltakia wa akapi. Mchimaka amangala tugatakia ma unipikta. Kawachi ni trawatima kiksuya ash chanteki education. President Biden, you can be on the right side of history. Shut down the Dakota Access Pipeline.
kokata hemia. Kawachi mikawa kamaha giksuya ouch. Chanteki echepukeshni. Katuya topa etaha mnicha. 1016 years laha. Hechata kokahia echunki. Wichunki chuk na koktapi wakpaki ahina.